A retired epidemiologist vanished during a solo hike in the Rocky Mountains. For 4 years, there were no leads, just a cold trail and an abandoned ranger station. Authorities assumed he fell, got lost, or simply chose to disappear. But then, a beaver dam broke open during a flood, and what investigators found inside changed everything. A waterproof notebook, human remains, and a trail of corruption hidden in plain sight. This is the story of Dr. Marcus Ellery and the truth he died protecting. The kitchen was filled with the scent of cinnamon and brewed coffee, but Evelyn Ellery barely noticed. Her hands moved by memory, 2 eggs, toast, a spoonful of jam, and yet her mind was elsewhere, circling the words Marcus had spoken just a day ago. "Just one day with the mountains," he had said, offering that warm, familiar smile, the kind that always seemed to fold the world's chaos into something manageable. "I need space to let this whole retirement thing settle." And she had nodded, kissed his cheek, and said something about bringing back a pine cone or a story. Now, she wished she had said more. At 62, Marcus Ellery wasn't the type to idle. He had worked 35 years as an epidemiologist at Denver's most respected center for public health. He'd spent decades parsing patterns and numbers, illnesses, outbreaks, correlations in community data that others missed. At home, he was no different. He measured everything: the weather before a hike, the battery level in his flashlight, even how many days were left on the wall calendar before retirement. But on this morning, October 15th, there was no talk of numbers. Just a packed backpack, worn hiking boots, and a goodbye that felt lighter than it should have. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window now, watching the early autumn mist rise above the evergreens. Their modest home in Evergreen, Colorado, offered a clear view of the Lost Creek wilderness, and somewhere beyond those ridgelines was her husband. Somewhere among the rocks and silence. She could almost hear his voice echo between the cliffs, naming birds, or laughing about how the trail never changed, even when life did. She didn't know it then, but that breakfast would be the last time she heard his voice. At precisely 7:04 a.m., Marcus had driven off in his old Subaru Outback, the one with the bumper sticker that read, "Science Saves Lives." Evelyn had watched the taillights disappear down their winding driveway, her hand instinctively clutching the warm mug in her palm a little tighter. There was something in the air, a tightness. Not fear exactly, but the sensation of something unresolved, like a page turned too quickly. He had chosen the Lost Creek area, not just for its natural beauty, but because it was one of his favorite places to think. Over the years, he had gone on dozens of solo hikes there, sometimes to unwind after a particularly frustrating policy decision, other times to clear his mind before giving a public health lecture. Evelyn had always respected that space. It was sacred to him. But this time felt different. She remembered the moment she noticed his hands shaking as he tied the laces on his boots. He had muttered something about things needing to be sorted, but brushed it off with a half laugh. By evening, when the sun dipped behind the pines and the light faded from their porch, Evelyn felt her chest tighten. Marcus had said he'd be back by dinner. He never missed dinner. He never turned off his phone. He always sent a check-in text from the trailhead. But tonight, silence hung heavy, as dense as the wilderness he'd walked into. Her calls rang endlessly. By midnight, when the ranger station still hadn't heard from any hikers reporting sightings of a man fitting Marcus's description, the park dispatched its first team to search. Evelyn didn't sleep that night, nor the next, nor the ones after. Helicopters were sent up, rescue dogs brought in, the GPS tracker embedded in his backpack, something Marcus had insisted on carrying for safety, yielded nothing. No signal, no coordinates, just static. Experts said maybe it had been damaged, maybe he'd wandered off trail, maybe he'd had a stroke, a fall, a sudden encounter with wildlife. Evelyn listened to it all, eyes dry and jaw locked. But she knew her husband. Marcus didn't make mistakes. He was careful to a fault. Before every hike, he reviewed trail maps, weather conditions, and even printed out emergency contacts just in case cell service failed. The idea that he had simply gotten lost was unthinkable, but so was the alternative, that he had chosen to disappear. Weeks passed, then months, then years. The headlines faded, the search party stopped, and eventually, Even the friends who once called daily tapered their concern into condolences. But Evelyn never stopped waiting. Every morning, she brewed 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. Every Sunday, she hiked the same trail Marcus once loved, just in case she saw something others had missed. She kept his side of the bed untouched, the walking shoes by the door, his favorite flannel still hanging in the closet. And yet, in those quiet moments when the night curled around the edges of her resolve, doubt began to whisper. What if he had wanted to leave? What if retirement had truly unsettled him? She hated those thoughts, but they crept in like cold air under the door, uninvited, but impossible to ignore. On the 4th anniversary of his disappearance, Evelyn stood again in the same kitchen, making breakfast out of habit rather than hunger. Outside, the sun carved golden lines across the mountaintops. She cracked 2 eggs into the skillet. They sizzled. She stared. And then the phone rang. The display read, U.S. Forest Service, Lost Creek Ranger Station. She froze. The phone trembled in Evelyn's hand as the screen blinked steadily with the name she hadn't seen in 4 years. Lost Creek Ranger Station. For a brief flickering moment, she considered letting it ring through, but instinct overruled fear. She answered. Mrs. Ellery? A voice asked. Calm, practiced, professional. Yes, she replied, her voice dry and uncertain. This is Ranger Dominic Walsh. I'm calling from Lost Creek Wilderness. There was a pause, the kind that bore too much weight. I wanted to inform you that earlier this morning, a group of hikers located a backpack. It was lodged in a beaver dam off South Platte River, about 8 miles from any marked trail. There was an embedded GPS device, and we were able to trace the serial number. It belongs to your husband. For several seconds, Evelyn didn't respond. Her eyes fixed on the wall calendar above the stove, the one still turned to October 4 years ago, the last month Marcus had been home. She had stopped flipping it after his disappearance. Her breath caught. You're certain? We are. There was also a laminated medical license inside. Marcus Ellery, Maryland, issued by the state board. Photo ID matches your husband's profile. We'd like you to come down to the station. There are some items we need you to verify, and the sheriff's department is involved. Evelyn pressed her palm flat against the counter to stay upright. Her knees felt like they might buckle. Of course, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'll be there within the hour. She hung up the phone and stared at her reflection in the kitchen window. For 4 years, she'd begged the world to give her a sign. And now that it had, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. What did it mean, this sudden discovery after all this time? A backpack couldn't explain where Marcus had gone, or why, or what happened to the man she'd loved for 40 years. The drive to the ranger station felt endless, despite being a route she knew by heart. Every bend of the mountain road carried memories. Marcus behind the wheel, pointing out hawks circling above the trees. Marcus singing softly to music that never left the radio above volume 5. Now, the road felt haunted, silent in all the wrong places. When she arrived, the station's parking lot was unusually crowded. 2 police cruisers flanked the ranger trucks, and a third vehicle, unmarked but unmistakably federal, was parked off to the side. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Inside, the wooden walls and the scent of pine oil were the same as she remembered. But the atmosphere had shifted. It was heavier, loaded with questions that had yet to be asked. Ranger Walsh greeted her at the door. He was tall, mid-40s, with a short, neatly trimmed beard, and a gaze that seemed to measure grief by the inch. Mrs. Ellery, thank you for coming so quickly. This is Detective Laura Kim from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Detective Kim was calm and composed, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a low bun, her voice steady. We appreciate you coming in. Please, take a seat. The conference room smelled of damp wood. On the table, carefully laid out on a plastic sheet, was the backpack. Mud-stained, torn near the zipper, and covered in traces of algae and pine debris. But Evelyn recognized it instantly. That's Marcus's, she said softly. I gave it to him for his birthday. He added the red carabiner on the side, said it helped him grab it fast if he needed to clip something. Ranger Walsh nodded. The GPS inside was waterlogged, but the memory card remained intact. The antenna broke off, which is why the device never transmitted a signal during previous searches. Detective Kim flipped open a manila folder and spread out a topographical map of the wilderness. According to the data retrieved, the last ping came from here. Her finger landed on an isolated patch of terrain, far from any established trail, deep into a remote ravine rarely accessed even by experienced hikers. There's no reason your husband should have been there, no marked paths, no points of interest, just sheer elevation and loose terrain. Evelyn blinked. That doesn't make sense. Marcus always followed registered trails. He filed his hiking routes with the Park Service religiously. That was our agreement. He was methodical, obsessive even. That's why this stood out, Kim said carefully. We've reviewed dozens of missing hiker cases in the area, and very few show this kind of deviation. It could suggest disorientation, intentional misdirection, or something else. Suicide? Evelyn's voice cracked. Kim didn't answer right away. Instead, she laid out more contents from the bag. Marcus's cracked phone, warped wallet, his hiking permit dated October 15th, and a worn medical ID. Then she said, "We don't like to speculate, but after 4 years, decomposition and wildlife leave very little trace. This backpack is the only physical link we have." Evelyn's hands hovered over the items, careful not to touch. Her heart ached. She stared at his phone, the one she had called again and again during those first panicked hours. "He was excited for retirement," she murmured. "We had plans, a trip to Alaska, teaching our grandson to fish. He wasn't depressed." Ranger Walsh glanced toward Kim, hesitated, and said quietly, "There's something else, Mrs. Ellery. The Beaver Dam where the pack was found. It's located far downstream. The flow patterns suggest it didn't just fall into water nearby. It had to travel miles, which means Marcus, or someone else, was deeper in the wilderness than anyone expected." Evelyn stood silently, piecing together the implications. If the GPS data was accurate, Marcus hadn't wandered off by accident. He had gone somewhere deliberately, intentionally, without telling her. But why? Detective Kim watched her carefully. "We won't reopen the case unless we have new leads," she said gently, "but we are documenting everything. If you recall anything unusual, anything your husband said or did in those final days, it could be helpful." Evelyn nodded slowly, though her mind was already racing elsewhere, not about what Marcus had said, but about what he hadn't. Outside the ranger station, the afternoon sun dipped low, casting gold across the pines. Evelyn walked to her car, the plastic bag of photocopied evidence clutched in her hand. The door closed with a quiet click, sealing her into the same silence that had defined the past 4 years. But this silence was different. It wasn't shaped by loss. It was shaped by questions. And for the first time since Marcus disappeared, Evelyn felt something stir beneath the weight of grief. It was suspicion. Evelyn parked outside the familiar brick building of the Denver Center for Population Health, a place that once pulsed with her husband's purpose. And for a long moment, she simply sat in the car, her hands wrapped around the steering wheel, as if anchoring herself to something solid, something that hadn't changed, even though everything else had. The center had been remodeled since Marcus disappeared. Sleek glass doors now replaced the old wooden ones, and the modest blue awning he had once insisted on for its calming color had been stripped away in favor of brushed steel and white LED signage. Inside, the sterile hum of modernity greeted her, all clean lines and chrome, and for a moment, Evelyn felt like an intruder in a place that used to feel like home. At the front desk, a young receptionist barely out of college looked up with polite detachment. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice rehearsed, transactional. "I'm Evelyn Ellery," she said. "My husband, Dr. Marcus Ellery, used to work here. I'm hoping to speak with someone who was here during his time." The receptionist frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, I don't recognize the name. I've only been here 18 months. Evelyn nodded, unsurprised, then asked quietly, "Is Monica Ruiz still here?" The receptionist tapped quickly on her keyboard, then nodded. "She's in the lab wing. I'll page her." Moments later, a woman emerged from the far hallway, shoulders square, hair pulled back in a bun, streaked with silver, eyes widening the moment they landed on Evelyn. "Charlotte?" she said, breath-catching. "Oh my God." The embrace was immediate, familiar, warm. "It's Evelyn," she corrected gently, smiling through the ache. "You still call me by his name." Monica pulled back, her face taut with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I think about him all the time. How are you?" Evelyn hesitated. They found his backpack in a beaver dam. GPS data shows he went miles off trail. The police think he may have gotten lost, or worse." Monica led her down the hallway into a private break room, away from the eyes and ears of the newly hired, the unfamiliar. The room still had remnants of the past, old corkboards, a faded microwave, the same coffee machine Marcus had used every morning. Monica sat across from her, hands folded. "That week," Evelyn said, barely above a whisper. "His last week here. Did you notice anything strange?" Monica's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, yes, he was different. Distracted, edgy even, but not in a way I understood at the time." Evelyn leaned forward. "Tell me." Monica took a breath. "He was constantly checking his phone between patients. He barely touched his lunch. I remember one afternoon, we were in this room. He was sitting right where you are now. I asked if he was okay. He gave me a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes, said he had things to sort before the next chapter. I thought it was retirement nerves. But now," she trailed off, eyes darkening, "I remember something else, something I never told anyone." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "Go on." "Dr. Prescott," Monica said carefully, "was acting strangely too. Julian." Evelyn's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" "That last week," Monica said, lowering her voice, "he insisted on handling all of Marcus's patient transitions himself. Wouldn't let the staff help. Normally it's a team effort, reassigning charts, notifying patients, managing schedules. But he stayed late every night, sometimes until midnight, locking himself in his office with boxes of files. I caught him one night. I had forgotten my keys, came back around 11, and saw his office light still on. He was loading boxes into his car." Evelyn blinked. "He took the files home?" Monica nodded. "All of them. And that's not standard. Those documents belong in central records, but Prescott said he'd take care of it personally. After Marcus disappeared, I tried not to think about it. Told myself it was grief talking, but now," she hesitated. "Evelyn, I think Marcus found something he wasn't supposed to see." Evelyn's mouth went dry. "He met with an employment attorney," she whispered. "He was researching whistleblower protection." Monica sat back, her hands visibly trembling now. "Jesus," she murmured. "It wasn't just about retirement, was it? He was planning to expose something." Evelyn nodded. "And the day he disappeared, he had a 7 a.m. meeting scheduled, with Julian, in his own handwriting." Monica's face went pale. "He never told me that. But I remember Julian acting jittery that morning. Came in late, said his wife had a migraine. But now that I think about it, his knuckles were scraped, and he looked like he hadn't slept." The room fell into silence, thick and pulsing with implication. "He killed him," Evelyn said softly, "or had something to do with it." Monica didn't speak, but the look in her eyes said everything Evelyn needed to know. The mask of grief that Evelyn had worn for 4 years began to peel away, revealing something colder, sharper, forged in the quiet conviction of truth. "I'm going to find out what happened," she said, standing slowly, "and I'm going to finish what Marcus started." Evelyn stood in the middle of the storage unit, dust clinging to her sleeves and the faint scent of mothballs filling the stale air, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled open another plastic bin labeled Office Marcus. Afternoon light streamed through the narrow window, catching floating particles in midair, like memory made visible. And still, she kept searching. Box after box of academic journals, old patient thank you cards, framed certificates, and laminated badges from decades of public health conferences. But none of it mattered unless she found something real, something now, something that explained why her husband had gone into the mountains with a backpack full of secrets and never returned. Then, as she dug through a battered banker's box wedged between 2 old thermoses and a hiking first aid kit, her fingers brushed against soft leather, worn and familiar. She exhaled sharply. Marcus's day planner. He had never taken to digital scheduling, no matter how many times Evelyn tried to get him to use his phone. "Pen and paper never crash," he used to joke, tapping the leather-bound book like it held state secrets, and perhaps, now, it did. She flipped it open, heart hammering in her chest. Most of the entries in early October were predictable. 7 a.m. staff meeting, 9:15 a.m. vaccination review, 12:30 p.m. lunch with board chair, 3 p.m. lab check-in. But then came the final week. October 12th to October 15th, when the routine fractured, scribbled notes stood out like blood on snow. Tuesday, F&B, 1 p.m., review protocol chain. F&B, Fisher and Blaine, the law firm. She turned the page. Wednesday, Patterson in a sock, 2 p.m., confirmed documentation. Another law firm. He'd been gathering advice. Evelyn's fingers moved more urgently now. Then Thursday, October 15th, The date burned in her memory like acid. Meet Julian, Trailhead, 7 a.m. She froze. Her mouth went dry. There it was, in Marcus's clean, precise handwriting. No ambiguity. No sign of confusion. He had lied to her over breakfast that morning. He hadn't gone for a solo hike to clear his mind. He had gone to meet Julian Prescott. Evelyn's legs wobbled, and she dropped onto a metal folding chair, the planner heavy in her lap. Why? Why hadn't he told her? And what had he expected to happen in that parking lot, standing face to face with the man who now circled her life like a vulture in polite disguise? Then she remembered something else, something small but nagging. Patterson and Associates. The name had appeared in the planner 2 days before the disappearance, and she had seen that name again, on a thin manila folder in the same box. She reached down, pulled out the folder, and opened it with the reverence of someone cracking a sealed vault. Inside were 3 receipts, stapled neatly together. Dates: October 7th, 10th, and 16th. Services rendered: legal consultation on employment protections, documentation handling, whistleblower immunity. The third appointment, the one on October 16th, Marcus never attended, because by then he was already gone. Evelyn blinked back tears and pulled out her phone. To her relief, she had 2 bars of service. She dialed the number on the receipt, hand shaking slightly. A woman picked up on the 3rd ring. "Fisher and Blaine, this is Sandra." "Hi," Evelyn said, steadying her voice. "My name is Evelyn Ellery. My husband, Marcus Ellery, was a client 4 years ago. I found some receipts. He went missing the day before his last scheduled meeting." There was a pause. "One moment, please," Sandra said. Evelyn was transferred, then placed on hold. Classical music trickled through the line. Vivaldi, she thought. And then a second voice, calm and professional, came on the line. "Mrs. Ellery, this is Miranda Dalton. I manage our legacy client archive. I see that your husband consulted with Mr. Fisher in October 4 years ago. I'm limited in what I can say due to privilege laws, but—" her voice softened. "I do remember him. Dr. Ellery came in asking very specific questions about whistleblower procedures, how to protect evidence chains, how to ensure his family couldn't be targeted if he came forward." Evelyn's throat closed. Targeted? "He never disclosed details about the organization," Miranda continued, "but it was clear he believed someone at his place of employment was engaged in large-scale misconduct. He asked about protected reporting channels and kept repeating, 'If I disappear, they'll need to know.' I thought he was being dramatic, until we heard about his disappearance." Evelyn's hand clutched the planner like a lifeline. "Did he name anyone?" "No," Miranda said, "but he did leave behind a copy of his compiled evidence packet. It was incomplete, pending review, but I still have it in storage. Would you like me to send it to you?" Evelyn's voice broke as she said yes. When she ended the call, she sat in the stillness of the unit, the silence around her no longer passive but electric, buzzing with the realization that Marcus hadn't vanished in confusion or despair. He had walked into something dark, something precise, something calculated, and the last person who saw him alive, Julian Prescott, was likely the only one who knew exactly what happened on that trail. Evelyn's hands were no longer trembling. They were steady now, focused. She closed the planner, slipped it into her bag, and locked the storage unit behind her. As she stepped into the late afternoon sun, her phone buzzed again. A text from her neighbor. "Dr. Prescott stopped by looking for you. Said he heard about the backpack. Looked agitated. I told him you'd gone to the storage unit." Evelyn stared at the message, then at the street ahead. Her chest tightened. He knew. Evelyn hadn't even stepped onto the porch before she saw it. That silver Mercedes parked in her driveway, gleaming under the slanted afternoon sun like a blade laid flat, silent but dangerous. And her heart stuttered at the sight of it, not just because she recognized the make or the color, but because she recognized the license plate. Heedlar 1, custom-ordered, arrogant, and unmistakably belonging to Julian Prescott. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was already out front chatting enthusiastically with him, the way small-town neighbors do, oblivious to subtext and tension, her hands animated as she described Evelyn's trip to the storage unit, like it was a casual spring-cleaning errand and not the retrieval of a dead man's final trail of breadcrumbs. Evelyn forced her steps forward, her mind already scanning possibilities, measuring words, calculating tone. "Charlotte!" Mrs. Chen called brightly, still using her husband's name, never adapting after the loss. Dr. Prescott's been waiting for you. I told him you were out. Evelyn's smile came out too tight. Thank you, Clara, she said, then turned to him. Julian. He turned, that polished expression already in place, all concerned warmth and quiet gravity. Evelyn, he said, his voice low and honeyed. I heard from the authorities this morning about Marcus's backpack. I wanted to check in on you, see how you're holding up. His eyes flicked to the back seat of her car, where she knew the edge of Marcus's planner was still visible through the mesh of her tote bag. That's thoughtful of you, she replied evenly. It's been a long day. Mrs. Chen chimed in again, completely unaware of the tension vibrating between them. I told him you'd gone to your storage unit. Those old boxes pile up, don't they? Julian's gaze darted back to Evelyn at the mention of storage, and there, just there, his smile faltered, the corner of his mouth pulling tight like fabric stretched too far, his eyes sharpening for the briefest of seconds before the mask slid back into place. Storage? He echoed lightly. Spring cleaning in October? Evelyn shrugged. Something like that. Just looking through some of Marcus's old things. The backpack stirred a lot up. Julian nodded sympathetically, but his gaze had become fixed, heavy, too attentive. Of course, grief does that. Sorting through belongings, old journals, files. Sometimes it brings closure, sometimes surprises. The word hung between them like a blade. Evelyn tilted her head. Surprises? She repeated, watching him closely. Oh, you know, he said with a practiced chuckle. Letters, notes, forgotten documents. Marcus was meticulous. I imagine he kept everything. He did, she said. You knew him well. I did, Julian said softly, and for a moment the warmth in his voice was too slick, too intentional. Which is why I wanted to offer you something. Some company. Would you like to grab coffee? Talk? It might help. Both of us. Evelyn's every instinct screamed that this was not a social gesture. It was a probe, a test, a way to keep her within reach, to gauge how much she knew. She considered her options, weighed risk versus advantage, and made a decision. Coffee sounds good, she said. Corner coffee, on Main? His face relaxed minutely. Perfect. I'll drive us. I'll follow, she said quickly. I have errands after. His nod was slow, measured, but she saw it. Disappointment tucked behind civility. He wasn't done fishing. As she turned to unlock her door, her fingers moved swiftly to her phone, pulling up her sister Ellen's number. Meeting Julian at Corner Coffee. If I don't text you in 2 hours, call the police. Not joking. Ellen's reply came instantly. What the hell is going on? Are you okay? Evelyn didn't answer. There was no time. She tossed the planner into her bag, locked the car, and slid behind the wheel. Julian's Mercedes pulled out first, smooth and soundless. Evelyn followed, every mile bringing her closer not to comfort, but to confirmation. The truth, she knew, was no longer a fog in the distance. It was right in front of her, polished, rehearsed, and trying desperately to stay buried. 10 minutes later, they parked. She made sure her car was visible from the front window. She chose a table near the entrance, in full view of baristas and patrons. She needed eyes, witnesses, time. Julian returned with their drinks. His black coffee, her vanilla latte, just like Marcus used to bring her. The mimicry stung. He used to talk about you constantly, Julian said, sitting down, about your hikes, your grandson, your garden. He adored you. Evelyn gave a measured smile. He adored truth more. No, Julian's eyes flickered. The police asked about his state of mind, you know. I told them Marcus was overwhelmed. Retirement hit him harder than any of us realized. Evelyn's heart thundered. That's not true. Sometimes people hide things, Julian said smoothly, even from their spouses, especially from their spouses. Evelyn leaned in. He wrote in his planner, meet Julian, trailhead, 7 a.m., the day he vanished. That wasn't confusion, that was intent. And there it was. Julian's composure cracked, just a little. His coffee cup stopped midair. The mask was slipping. People misremember things when they are under stress, he murmured, especially when grief clouds the mind. Are you sure you're recalling it correctly? I have it, Evelyn said, voice like ice, in his own handwriting. Julian blinked, then smiled again, but it was no longer warm. It was tight, dry, and increasingly hollow. If you find anything in those files, anything that seems confusing, I'd be happy to help you make sense of it, for Marcus's legacy. Evelyn nodded slowly, then stood. His legacy doesn't need your help. It never did. She turned to leave, feeling his gaze burning into her back. But her mind was already racing toward the next step. He knew she had the planner. He knew she'd been digging. And now, she was certain. Julian Prescott wasn't worried about what Marcus might have left behind. He was terrified, Dot. The first thing Evelyn noticed when she stepped back into the coffee shop was that Julian had moved. His drink sat abandoned on the other side of the table, but he was no longer in his seat. He was now on her side of the booth, positioned directly between her and the exit. His polished shoes crossed neatly, his posture relaxed, in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural. "There you are," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I was starting to worry." Evelyn forced a tight nod, slid back into the booth slowly, cautiously, her every nerve flaring. "Sorry," she said, voice carefully even. "I needed a moment. Everything just feels a little overwhelming today." "Understandable," Julian said, folding his hands. But something had shifted in his tone. Gone was the soft concern, replaced now with a measured scrutiny, like a man inspecting the frame of a window before deciding whether to break it or climb through. He leaned forward slightly. "You know, I drove past your place this morning," he said casually, "around 6, on my way to the hospital. Noticed you had boxes loaded in your car. You've been busy." Evelyn's stomach dropped. There had been no boxes by the curb, nothing visible from the street. He hadn't just driven past. He had been watching. "Just sorting old paperwork," she said quickly. "Nothing important, just memories." Julian's smile tightened. Marcus kept copies of everything, didn't he? He was always so meticulous, so righteous. The last word came out like a curse. Evelyn tried to slide out of the booth, but Julian didn't move. "I should go," she said. "My sister's expecting me." "She'll wait," Julian replied, his voice lower now, flatter. "I think we should take a little drive first." She froze. "What?" His smile dissolved. In its place was something far colder. "Stand up," he said softly. "We're leaving." "Julian." "Now." She hesitated, looked around the cafe, but the crowd was distracted. Students hunched over laptops, a pair of older women deep in conversation, the baristas busy with a blender. No one was watching. No one saw Julian's hand dip into the inside of his blazer and withdraw something small and black, discreet, held low, and pointed directly at her ribcage. "Don't make me cause a scene, Evelyn," he said calmly. "You're going to stand up, smile, and walk out of here like nothing's wrong. You understand me?" Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. She nodded. "Okay," she whispered. She rose to her feet slowly, Julian pressing close behind her, as he guided her out of the cafe with the subtle precision of someone who'd thought this through. Once outside, he nudged her toward his Mercedes, opening the passenger door with one hand while keeping the gun pressed discreetly against her side. "Get in." She climbed in. The gun disappeared beneath his jacket again as he moved around the hood and got in the driver's seat. The engine started with a soft purr, far too civilized a sound for what was happening. He drove in silence for several blocks, the autumn light casting shadows through the windshield, dappled and golden. Like this might still be any other afternoon in Evergreen, but Evelyn knew the route. He was heading toward the mountains, the same direction Marcus had gone 4 years ago. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice shaking. "Whatever you're hiding—" "Shut up," Julian said, no longer bothering with civility. This didn't have to happen. You were supposed to let sleeping dogs lie. 4 years of peace, Evelyn. 4 years of silence, and you just had to dig." "You killed him," she whispered. "You couldn't let him report you." Julian didn't look at her. His jaw was set, his hands steady on the wheel. "Marcus chose this," he said bitterly. "He could have taken the money, could have retired with you, sailed off to Alaska like he planned. But no, he had to be a hero. Had to report the billing audits, the research data, the organ program." "Organ program?" Evelyn choked. "You were—" "I built something," Julian snarled. "Something efficient, something profitable. You think every patient on those wait lists could afford to wait? We cut through red tape. Everyone benefited. And then Marcus, with his spreadsheets and moral compass, decided it was criminal. Because it was," Evelyn said, the words almost involuntary. "You used your practice to launder human lives." Julian slammed the steering wheel. "I saved lives," he shouted. "And he threw it all away. 40 years of work. He betrayed me." The trees grew denser now. They were well outside city limits, the road narrower, the turns sharper. Evelyn recognized the area. They were nearing the Lost Creek trailhead. Her hands began to shake. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "I have grandchildren. I'm not a threat to you." "You should have thought about that before you started poking around storage units," Julian said coldly. "Now I need to know exactly what you found and who else knows about it." He reached into his jacket again. "If you scream, if you move, I swear to God I'll end this right now." Evelyn stared at the dashboard, her fingers curling into fists in her lap, praying silently that Ellen had followed instructions, that someone had noticed, that time hadn't run out. Julian turned off the main road and onto a gravel path that wound through the woods. The last thing Evelyn saw before the forest swallowed the sunlight was a wooden trail sign, one she remembered from the photos police had shown her 4 years ago. Marcus had passed this way, and now so would she. The crunch of gravel under the tires grew sharper as Julian's Mercedes bumped along the uneven forest road, tall pines closing in on both sides, like silent witnesses gathering to watch history repeat itself. And Evelyn sat frozen in the passenger seat, her hands clenched tight in her lap, every muscle taut with anticipation and dread, her breath shallow and ragged beneath the seatbelt strap pressing across her chest. She had never been here before, not in person, but she recognized everything from the photos the search teams had once brought her, the curve of the trees, the slant of the light, the jagged profile of the distant ridge that had become synonymous with loss. This was the place Marcus had last been seen, and now Julian had brought her back to it like a closing circle, as if returning to the scene of the crime gave him back control. He cut the engine in a small clearing, the forest swallowing the sound with eerie efficiency, and turned to her with a look that no longer wore the mask of civility. His face now was drawn tight with fear disguised as anger, his eyes hollow, rimmed with the frantic glint of a man who had run out of moves. "Out," he said, the gun now resting on his thigh, casual in its placement, but very much not a bluff. Evelyn opened the door slowly and stepped out into the pine-scented air, the cold breeze cutting through her sweater, her skin prickling not from the chill, but from the overwhelming sense of déjà vu. She was walking Marcus's last path, and the weight of it settled on her shoulders like stone. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "Just a walk," Julian said with a bitter twist of his mouth. "You like nature, right? Marcus always said it helped him think." He gestured with the gun toward a narrow footpath that snaked into the trees, its entrance barely visible beneath fallen leaves and creeping ivy. Evelyn obeyed, her shoes crunching softly with every step, each one echoing with the memory of Marcus doing the same 4 years earlier. Only he had believed he could reason with Julian, believed that there was still honor buried in the man who had once toasted their anniversary and signed birthday cards for their grandson. Now she knew better. Now she understood what Marcus must have seen in those final moments. The terrible clarity that the man across from him was not desperate, but dangerous. The path curved steeply upward, roots jutting from the earth like gnarled fingers, and Evelyn stumbled once, catching herself against a moss-slicked boulder. Julian was close behind her, breathing heavier now, though whether it was from exertion or tension, she couldn't tell. "Keep going," he snapped. "We're almost there." "There?" she asked, risking a glance over her shoulder. "Where you did it." "Shut up," he said, his voice cracking like glass under pressure. "Don't pretend you understand what was at stake. You and Marcus, always so damn pure. You never had to make hard choices." "You call murder a hard choice?" she said, the words rising before she could stop them. He grabbed her arm, spun her around, and shoved the barrel of the gun against her chest. "You think I wanted this?" he hissed. "He left me no choice. He was going to the FBI. He had files, names. I would have lost everything. He gave you a choice," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "You just didn't like the one that made you accountable." For a moment, Julian said nothing. Then he shoved her forward again. "Move." But the silence had changed. Somewhere in the trees, a distant sound echoed, soft at first, then growing. The faint, unmistakable whine of sirens carried on the wind. Julian stopped. Evelyn heard it too. Her heart surged. He turned sharply, scanning the woods. "What the hell is that?" "Help," she said simply. "I called 911. They know I was with you. They tracked my phone." "You bitch," he hissed, grabbing her arm. "You lied to me." "No," she said, jerking away. "I finally told the truth." The sirens grew louder, closer, joined now by the mechanical thumps of boots through underbrush, and the barking of a distant dog. Julian's panic snapped like a breaking wire. He grabbed her, spinning her around and wrapping one arm around her neck. The gun now pressed against her temple as they backed toward the trees. "Back off!" he screamed into the forest. "I swear I'll kill her!" Voices called out from beyond the tree line. "Julian Prescott, this is Detective Laura Kim. We're armed and surrounding the area." "Let her go and we can talk." Evelyn could feel his heart pounding against her spine, could feel the gun trembling slightly against her skin. He was breaking, coming apart at the seams. "You don't understand," he screamed into the void. "He destroyed everything. Marcus was going to ruin all of it." "You did that to yourself, Julian," she shouted, trying to wrench free. "Marcus gave you a chance. You killed him to protect a lie." "Shut up!" he screamed, slamming the gun's butt into the side of her head. The world tilted, whitened, rang like a bell. She fell to her knees. He turned, desperate, bolting through the trees, but the forest exploded. Figures in black uniforms emerging from shadows, voices shouting, orders given, and within seconds he was on the ground, pinned, screaming. "He wouldn't listen. He made me do it. I begged him to stop." And Evelyn lay curled beside a fallen log, blood dripping down the side of her face, and through the blur of pain and leaves, she saw Julian's face for the last time. Not triumphant, not composed, but twisted in raw defeat, broken under the weight of truth he could no longer outrun. They had found her, but more importantly, they had found him. Dot. The fluorescent lights of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Station flickered slightly overhead as Evelyn sat on a hard plastic chair in the interview room, a butterfly bandage stretching across her right temple where Julian had slammed the gun into her skull, the pain dull now beneath a veil of adrenaline and disbelief. And though she had refused to be taken to the hospital until she gave her full statement, the EMTs had insisted on at least cleaning the wound and checking her pupils. Her fingers were still sticky with dried blood as she clasped them together on the table, her bag resting at her feet like an anchor, the weight of Marcus's planner still inside. Detective Laura Kim entered with a folder thick with printed reports and transcripts, her face lined with fatigue, but alert, focused, razor sharp. She sat across from Evelyn and placed a small digital recorder between them. "Take your time," she said gently, her voice a calm contrast to the chaos of the past few hours. "Start wherever you're comfortable." And Evelyn did. She told them everything, from the phone call about the backpack to the conversation with Monica, the discovery of the planner, the call to the law firm, the coffee shop meeting, the gun, the forest, the screams. Her voice shook when she recounted the drive into the mountains, but she did not stop. She painted a full picture of a man unraveling, of a friend turned predator, of a husband who had died not from misadventure or despair, but from calculated betrayal. When she finished, Detective Kim sat in silence for a long moment, then nodded once and stood. "Prescott's story is already starting to fall apart," she said. "He's in interrogation room 2. When faced with the planner and the mention of whistleblower law firms, he began talking. A lot." Evelyn's breath caught. "He confessed?" "He broke," Kim said flatly. "And then he confessed." 15 minutes passed before Kim returned, her face harder now, the folder in her hand even thicker than before. She placed it on the table and opened it slowly. Julian Prescott admits that 4 years ago, on the morning of October 15th, he met Marcus at the Lost Creek trailhead as scheduled. He brought 2 men with him, employees at his clinic. They weren't part of the research team. They were maintenance, data cleanup, off-the-books kinds of hires. Gabe Molina and Trevor Brandt, both now in custody. Evelyn's nails dug into her palms. Why? Why bring them? Kim looked up, eyes grim. "He says he wanted witnesses, leverage, or backup. He claims they only meant to talk, to convince Marcus not to go to the FBI. But Marcus had already compiled too much. Billing irregularities, false trial participants, forged data sets, and unlicensed transplants done under a research cover. He had spreadsheets, email records, names. Prescott offered him money, a lot of it. Marcus refused. He was ready to go public. Evelyn whispered, "So they pushed him?" Kim hesitated. "Prescott says one of the others did, that it got out of hand. But based on the pattern of lies, we think he gave the order, if he didn't push Marcus himself. It was a 200-foot drop. Death would have been instant." Evelyn shut her eyes. "And the backpack?" "Prescott says they damaged the GPS manually, destroyed the antenna, then threw the bag into the river to make it look like Marcus got lost. It drifted for miles before a beaver dam caught it. Dumb luck or fate, it finally surfaced now. Evelyn opened her eyes again, her voice small but sharp. And the evidence Marcus had? Some of it was in your storage unit. Planner, receipts, notes. But the rest? Prescott claims he destroyed it, burned the files, deleted the backups. But we're searching his home, his office, his off-site property. And the FBI is stepping in. This thing's bigger than local authorities. Evelyn blinked. FBI? Kim nodded. Prescott wasn't just stealing from insurance companies. He was part of an interstate network. Illegal organ trafficking masked under medical research programs. The kind of thing that needs a federal task force. Marcus found the first thread. You pulled the second. And now, it's all unraveling. Evelyn pressed a trembling hand to her chest, her heartbeat slow and heavy beneath her palm. So it's over? For Marcus, Kim said quietly. Yes, he can rest now. For Prescott, it's just beginning. Another knock at the door. An officer entered, whispered to Kim, and left. Kim turned back to Evelyn. Based on the confession, we dispatched a helicopter team to the coordinates Prescott gave us. They've located remains, lodged in a ravine beneath the cliff. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. Marcus. They're recovering him now, Kim said. We'll need DNA confirmation, but it's him, we're sure. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of finality, sorrow, release. Evelyn let the tears fall freely, not just because she finally knew the truth, but because her husband, her meticulous, noble, too honest for this world husband, had died doing exactly what he had promised he would always do, protect what was right. Kim closed the folder, her voice gentler now. We'll arrange for a full briefing with the Bureau. You'll be given the choice of a formal statement, witness protection if needed, and whatever support we can offer. Evelyn stood slowly. Her legs were weak, but her back was straight. I don't need protection, she said. I just need to bring him home. As she stepped out of the room, the light in the hallway hit her face, and though the pain throbbed in her temple and the grief clawed at her heart, there was something else beneath it, a sense of completion. Marcus hadn't just vanished. He had died a whistleblower, a husband, a man who saw wrong and refused to look away. And now, because she hadn't looked away either, his story would be known. His death would not be silence. It would be testimony. The mountain was quiet when Evelyn arrived, its massive shoulders draped in a late October mist that clung to the treetops and softened the jagged ridgelines. But nothing could mute the sharp ache in her chest as the recovery team guided her gently toward the clearing near the cliff's edge, where a perimeter had been marked off in bright tape, and officers moved with careful reverence through the undergrowth. She didn't want to see the remains. She had told them that firmly. But she needed to be there, needed to feel the earth beneath her feet where Marcus had last stood, needed to breathe the air he had breathed before it was all taken from him. The forest was still, as if holding its breath. She stood a few paces back from the drop, hands clasped in front of her, staring into the ravine below where they had recovered what was left of him. Fragments of bone, the metal frame of his GPS device, a shredded piece of his hiking jacket. The rest, they said, had been scattered or taken by time, weather, and wildlife. But it was enough. Enough for closure. Enough for burial. She looked down at the steep rock face and imagined the moment. Marcus standing here, the man he had once trusted facing him with false concern. Maybe still pretending this was a conversation instead of a confrontation. Maybe Marcus still hoped he could talk Julian down, that reason would prevail, that decency could still be found in a man who had built an empire of lies inside a clinic built to heal. Evelyn imagined the words, calm, rational, Marcus always so measured, even as Julian's anger cracked beneath its polished surface, even as those two men, Gabe and Trevor, stood a few feet behind, silent muscle pretending to be witnesses but prepared to become enforcers. Maybe there was shouting, maybe not. Maybe Marcus simply said no one final time, turned to walk away, and never saw the shove coming. Or maybe he did. Maybe he saw it in Julian's eyes and chose not to run. Chose to stand firm, even if it meant falling. The ravine was over 200 feet deep, sheer granite and jagged boulders below, and the investigators said the impact had likely killed him instantly, his body tumbling before settling between two rocks where it had remained, hidden from sight, for 4 years until Julian finally broke under the weight of Evelyn's determination. She stepped back from the edge, the air sharp in her lungs, and turned to the lead recovery agent, who handed her a sealed evidence bag with gloved hands. Inside was a small zippered pouch, weathered, water-damaged, but intact. It was tucked into a side pocket of the backpack, the agent said softly. We almost missed it. Evelyn took the pouch, heart racing. She knew it wasn't the main evidence packet. That had been destroyed, burned by Julian in some frenzy of desperation. But this, whatever it was, Marcus had kept close. Something he hadn't handed over to lawyers or hidden in folders. Something personal. She opened it with trembling hands and drew out a stack of index cards, laminated together in twos. Each was labeled with a date, a time, a patient code, and beneath it, a hand-drawn chart or note, Marcus's clean, looping script unmarred by panic or haste. There were 15 cards in all, handwritten observations from within the clinic, sketches of prescription timelines that didn't match billing reports, symbols that Evelyn didn't understand, but that clearly meant something to Marcus. This was his shorthand, his private cipher. On the final card, a short note. If I'm gone, tell the truth, start with the files. Start with Julian. Evelyn felt the tears rise again, not from grief, but from awe. Even as he knew the walls were closing in, even as he knew the meeting with Julian might not end with words, Marcus had created one final map. One more way to ensure the truth could not be buried with him. The FBI team confirmed the cards matched a series of deleted reports they had recovered from Julian's system backups. Data he thought was erased, but lingered in secure drive fragments and off-site log mirrors. Marcus's notations filled in the gaps, provided context no algorithm could guess. Evelyn handed over the cards with care, knowing they were no longer just scraps of evidence. They were Marcus's last breath, translated into ink. That night, back at home, Evelyn sat by the window with a mug of tea growing cold in her hands, the planner resting on her lap, open to that now infamous page. October 15th, 7 a.m., meet Julian Trailhead. She traced the letters with her finger, thinking of the morning he left, the kiss on her cheek, the casual promise to be home for dinner. He had never lied to her, not about anything that mattered. But this he had kept secret, not out of deception, but out of love. Because he had known. He had known that Julian might try to stop him, that what he had uncovered was big enough to bring powerful people down. He had protected her the only way he could, by shielding her from the storm, even as he walked straight into it. Evelyn leaned her head back against the cushion and let the silence settle around her. Not the silence of mystery, but the kind that follows truth. The kind that comes when the last piece has clicked into place, even if the picture it creates is devastating. Marcus was gone. But now, finally, she understood where he had gone, why, and what he had left behind. He hadn't vanished into the wilderness. He had walked into the fire with his eyes open, armed with integrity, and trusted the woman he loved to carry the torch when he no longer could. The morning of Marcus Ellery's funeral dawned pale and cold, as if the weather itself had paused in silent acknowledgement of a man whose final act was not one of surrender, but of defiance in the face of corruption. And as Evelyn stood beneath the canopy, beside the modest grave in Boulder's Rosewood Cemetery, a breeze tugged gently at her long black coat, stirring the edge of the folded American flag she now clutched in both hands. The ceremony had been small, only close friends, a handful of former colleagues from the university hospital, a few tearful patients who remembered Marcus's quiet thoroughness, and the way he never rushed an appointment. The casket was closed, of course. What remained of him had been minimal, carefully preserved, but fragmented. But Evelyn didn't need to see his face to feel his presence. She had felt it in every note he left behind, every scribbled date and calculation, every whisper of conscience that had survived long enough to matter. As the final words were spoken and the casket lowered, Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the silence settle again. Not the silence of mystery, but the full-bodied hush of truth, the kind that no longer demanded answers, but instead asked for action. That afternoon, she returned home not to rest, but to begin. On her desk lay a fresh manila folder, this one marked by the federal case number the FBI had assigned to the operation that now spanned 5 states, 22 fraudulent transplants, and millions in diverted research funds. The task force had named the investigation after Marcus, Operation Ellery, in tribute to the man who had sparked the unraveling. But to Evelyn, the real tribute would be what came next. the files, the people, the prosecutions. She opened the folder and began cataloging every name Marcus had referenced, cross-checking it against the recovered index cards and the shredded financials that forensic accountants were slowly reassembling. She knew she wasn't a prosecutor or a federal agent, but she was still Marcus's wife, and she knew how his mind worked, how his logical, quiet patterns fit together like clockwork, how he buried meaning and structure. Within a week, Evelyn had identified 3 more clinics tied to Julian's network, fronts disguised as pain management centers and community care hubs, each one feeding into the same research database Marcus had flagged. She didn't wait for permission. She emailed the case officers directly, attaching annotations, timestamps, discrepancies. He would have done this himself, she wrote in one message, so I will. When Julian's arraignment was held in Denver Superior Court 3 weeks later, Evelyn sat silently in the second row, flanked by 2 federal agents and Marcus's sister, her hands folded neatly in her lap as Julian Prescott was led into the courtroom in a navy blue jumpsuit, his once groomed hair now streaked with gray and disorder. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, on the table, on the cuffs that shackled his wrists like punctuation marks on a life that had believed itself untouchable. The charges were read aloud: racketeering, medical fraud, manslaughter, conspiracy to commit murder, and each one echoed like a thunderclap in the courtroom's high ceiling. Evelyn didn't flinch. She had already flinched enough for a lifetime. But it was Julian's lawyer, a narrow-faced man named Hauser, who raised a motion to suppress the planner, claimed it had been found through improper civilian intervention, claimed Evelyn's role complicated the chain of evidence. The room tensed. Evelyn rose before the judge even called her. "May I speak?" she asked. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, studied her a moment, then nodded. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice firm. "Your Honor, the planner was in my storage unit. It was not stolen, not planted, not manipulated. My husband wrote it. He dated it. He left it knowing someone would find it. It's not a prop in a courtroom. It's a map. It pointed to the truth, and that truth led to the man you see here today." She paused, lifting her chin. Marcus Ellery didn't vanish. He was erased, and every document he left behind was a cry for help he didn't live long enough to send. I heard it anyway. That planner wasn't evidence. It was a promise. The judge stared at her for a long, breathless moment, then turned to the prosecutor. Motion to suppress denied. The gavel rang out once. Evelyn returned to her seat, heart pounding not with fear but with resolve. She hadn't just found Marcus's truth. She had learned how to speak it, in courtrooms and files and cold halls, where justice sometimes moved like glacier melt, slow but unstoppable. That night, back at home, Evelyn lit a single candle on the back porch and sat with Marcus's photo beside her, the planner resting closed on her lap. "You were right," she whispered. "Truth takes time, but it always finds its voice." The wind moved through the trees like breath, rustling the leaves, and though he was gone, Evelyn could almost hear his voice, calm and unwavering. Then, "Let's keep going." Dot. The Capitol building loomed in solemn stillness as Evelyn stepped through the echoing marble corridor, the sound of her modest heels tapping against polished stone like the pulse of something ancient and unflinching. And though she had imagined this moment, replayed it in fevered dreams, in restless nights curled beside Marcus's unopened letters, nothing could have prepared her for the gravity of walking into a room where the air itself seemed to listen. The Senate Health and Ethics Oversight Committee had convened a special hearing after Operation Ellery exposed not only Julian Prescott's criminal network, but a chilling vacuum of accountability in federal grant oversight, transplant regulation, and whistleblower protection. Evelyn, invited as the lead civilian witness, stood now at the edge of a long mahogany table beneath the weight of a dozen senators' eyes. Cameras clicked quietly behind the press barrier. Every word she was about to speak would live in public record forever. She adjusted the microphone, her throat dry but steady. "My name is Evelyn Ellery. My husband, Dr. Marcus Ellery, disappeared on October 15th, 4 years ago while trying to expose a criminal fraud operation hidden inside the clinical research infrastructure of this country. For 4 years, he was considered lost, perhaps suicidal. For 4 years, I lived with silence, and then I found his notes, and then I found his body, and then I found the truth. A hushed stillness fell over the room. She opened a small leather folder and withdrew the laminated index cards. These are what he left behind. Not much, but enough. Enough to point federal investigators to forged organ transplants, to medical falsifications, to a man who ordered Marcus's death to protect profits. One of the senators, a white-haired man with the edge of a southern accent, leaned forward. "Mrs. Ellery, may I ask, at what point did you realize your husband had been murdered?" Evelyn met his eyes. "The moment I saw his handwriting beside Julian's name, dated the day he vanished. Marcus didn't write things down carelessly. Every note had intent. He wasn't just documenting fraud. He was building a record in case he didn't come back. It was his version of a last will." Another senator, a former surgeon, tapped a file in front of him. "These reports suggest over a dozen patients received unapproved transplant procedures under Julian Prescott's clinics, many of them from undocumented donors. Have you been contacted by any of those families?" "Some," Evelyn nodded. "Some don't know yet what really happened to their loved ones. Some don't want to know. But others, they've been waiting, like I was, waiting for someone to say out loud that something was wrong." The committee chairwoman, sharp-suited and solemn, spoke next. "Mrs. Ellery, what do you believe failed your husband most? The clinic's ethics board? The state regulators? The justice system?" Evelyn paused, then said quietly, "None of them protected him. But more than that, none of them believed him. He had reported concerns to a professional review panel, but no action was taken. His research warnings were shelved. His grant audits were delayed. We say we want transparency. But when people try to provide it, we punish them with silence." A ripple moved through the gallery. Evelyn leaned forward. "My husband wasn't a hero by choice. He was a scientist, a father, a man who believed in evidence and reason. But when faced with corruption, he refused to look away. And that choice cost him everything." One senator cleared his throat, visibly moved. "And what would you ask of us now, Mrs. Ellery?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. "I want new legislation. Real protections for whistleblowers in the medical field, mandatory auditing of clinics receiving federal grants, a nationwide patient registry for transplant sources. And I want Julian Prescott to die in prison knowing that he didn't bury a man, he raised a movement." The room was silent for several heartbeats. Then the chairwoman said softly, "Noted." When Evelyn stepped out of the chamber an hour later, the corridor was lined with reporters, their microphones outstretched, but she passed through them like mist, saying nothing, her purpose not yet complete. That night, she returned to the now iconic planner Marcus had left behind, its edges worn, its cover dented, but its contents shining with relevance. She had promised herself not to rest until every lead had been followed, every victim named, and every loophole sealed. She turned to the last blank page in the planner and with slow, careful script wrote, "March 11th. Testified before Congress." Justice began today. As she closed the book, the silence in her home felt different. Less like grief, more like a cathedral. She was no longer a widow searching for answers. She was a woman with a mission, a voice, and a promise she would never break. It was a quiet morning, the kind that stretched itself out in soft light and long silences. And for once, Evelyn Ellery let herself move slowly through it. Barefoot on the hardwood floors, the smell of cinnamon tea warming the air, the house no longer filled with shadows, but something gentler. Presence, memory, not grief, but a softer kind of missing. The hearings were over. Julian Prescott had been denied bail and would stand trial in the fall, facing charges that carried multiple life sentences. The FBI investigation had broadened beyond anything Marcus could have imagined, touching pharmaceutical boards, private equity-backed clinics, even former regulators. And still, Evelyn worked each night with the task force, combing files, annotating timelines, translating Marcus's notations, like a second language she had learned from love. But this morning, she let the work wait. She pulled an old sweater over her shoulders and opened the curtains to the backyard, where the sun filtered through bare branches. Her phone was on silent, her laptop asleep. And then, just as she took her first sip of tea, there was a knock at the door. Not urgent, not hurried, just present. When she opened it, a young man stood on the porch, his frame thin beneath a gray windbreaker, a faded backpack over one shoulder, and eyes that carried a familiarity she couldn't place. "Are you Evelyn Ellery?" he asked, voice quiet but steady. She nodded. "I am." He hesitated, then pulled something from the pocket of his jacket, a small, creased envelope. "This is from your husband," he said. "From Marcus. He asked me to bring it to you if anything ever happened." Evelyn stared, her breath caught halfway between past and present. "I don't understand. Who are you?" The young man offered a faint smile. "My name is Raphael. I was a medical student. I interned under him. He didn't tell me everything, just enough to know something was wrong. He told me if he ever disappeared, and if someone came asking the right questions, that I should come here, that I'd know when." Evelyn reached for the envelope with trembling hands. The paper was worn, but sealed, Marcus's handwriting unmistakable on the front. She stepped aside, nodded for Raphael to come in, and he followed her into the living room where they sat across from each other, the silence thick with waiting. "He didn't want you to worry," Raphael said softly. "He said you already carried too much. But he left something else with me, a drive, data, the full file, not just the planner, everything. He gave it to me in case his lawyer got scared, in case the system folded. He trusted me to hold it, but he never told me what happened to him. I only found out last week, after the hearing, after I saw your name on the news." Evelyn stared at him. "You're saying the file exists?" Raphael nodded. "Encrypted, backups, video logs, patient statements, the kind of thing that could shut down 10 clinics, not just Julian's." She blinked back the tears building behind her eyes. "Why did you wait?" "Because I needed to be sure you were ready," he said gently. "He said you'd know what to do with it. And watching you bring all this to light, Congress, the hearings, it's time." She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a note, handwritten in Marcus's precise style, addressed simply, "If this finds you, then I'm gone, but the work isn't. You were always my clearest thought, Evelyn. Finish this. For me. For them." Her hands shook, but she smiled through the tears. The planner, the cards, the Senate. It had never been the end. It had been the foundation. This was the final piece, the hard evidence, the thing Julian had tried to destroy but never found, because Marcus had outthought him, had trusted a quiet intern with a silent torch. Evelyn rose from the couch and walked to her desk. She opened the drawer where Marcus's badge still lay beside a faded photo of them hiking, young and laughing. She placed the letter beside it, then turned back to Raphael. "Let's plug it in," she said. "Let's end this the way he wanted." Raphael handed her the drive, and as she inserted it into her laptop, the screen flickered once, then opened a folder labeled Everest. Inside were dozens of files, spreadsheets, names, dates, testimonies. But at the top was one final video file titled For Evelyn. She clicked it. The screen lit up with Marcus's face, tired but calm, speaking into a dimly lit room. "If you're watching this," he said, "then I didn't make it back. But I need you to know, I never stopped believing. In the truth. In this cause. In you. If the world hears this through your voice, then it was worth it. I love you." The video cut to black. Evelyn sat in silence, the screen reflecting in her eyes, the grief deep. Yes, but finally complete. She had lost him. But he had left her everything. And now, because of that, because of love and persistence and the unwavering light of one good man, the silence was broken, and justice at last had found its voice. Dr. Marcus Ellery's discovery exposed a hidden network and triggered one of the largest medical ethics investigations in recent history. But questions still remain. How many more like him were silenced, and what systems allowed it to happen? One notebook found in a beaver dam may have changed the course of a national conversation. The rest may still be out there,